Alright, I apologize for the setup. I did have a stand for my phone, but then the phone that fit it broke, and now it doesn't work with the new one. I'm trying. Anyway, porcelain dolls. The best way to make your grandparents want to disinherit you. Grand. So, a problem that typically happens, especially when it comes to decorative objects or art in general, is that it becomes unused or like untouched. We seem to have this idea that art, once it's finished, can't be reused or recycled, and that we're ruining it if we try to alter it afterwards. But that also means that art can become very expensive, and the idea of it can seem very inaccessible to people who may not be able to create new pieces of art and etc. regularly. And there's also a lot of overconsumerism involved in it, which leads to a lot of environmental issues, especially when it comes to things like porcelain dolls, which, especially for me, were used the majority of the time when I was a little kid, or they were bought for me while I was a little kid, and I outgrew them. They were like pink and frilly, and despite the color of my walls, that's not my vibe anymore, for lack of a better term. And so being able to change those dolls and use a variety of materials that may seem more difficult to use initially, especially if they're like scraps and you aren't sure if they're going to fit exactly how you'd like them to, being able to use those kind of unapproachable materials rather than going out and buying new ones each time you want to do an art project, and kind of building those skills is very important. And so having like these ideas of doing that it was the point of the project. So the problem being addressed was overconsumption and of art, and then not using it, reusing it, or letting it go to waste by not enjoying it anymore but refusing to change it. So the goal of the project was to use various materials that were unused, even if they seemed more unapproachable, to use on the porcelain dolls and alter them. I intended to alter the hair, faces, and clothing of 5 dolls while maintaining a low budget. I was able to I ended up with $20 or so of actual spending money on the project, and the majority of my materials either came from borrowing from family members, etc., or just finding them around my house using, like, I was in fashion, and so I had a lot of sewing scraps, that type of thing. I did not fully alter the clothing of every single doll like I intended. I intended to make one new piece of clothing for every doll and change and like alter the dolls that the clothes that they already had. But I ended up making 2 new outfits, and then the rest were kind of altering already existing ones by adding trim or something simpler. I did end up altering the hair of every doll, but not exactly to the extent I wanted. But for the most part, I altered the faces of the dolls as much as I intended to. I changed for specific dolls. I didn't paint their entire bodies and instead changed added specific details instead. But I was happy with how much I painted. So how I measured how much I achieved these goals was through this idea of I would sketch the outfits of these dolls and then determine how close was the end product to that sketch. A lot of times there would be stylistic changes where I'm just like, well, actually, I don't have that specific color available, so I'm going to need to change the extent in which I use this because it'll cost too much if I use it too often. Or, well, actually, with how the clothes ended up, I need to change either the shade of color or the design of painting or the hair based on how much of the doll's face was painted, etc. And so a lot of times these plans would change more regularly. I eventually ended up being able to create sketches that were more broad, allowing me more creative freedom during the process, but initially I really struggled to do that. And uh, to maintain the budget, I wrote down the amount that of money that everything costed, etc., and the origin of the majority of materials, and most were secondhand or unused ones that I had, etc. So there was very little waste. In fact, the majority of the budget went to buying dyes, and that was about it. It was just buying like cheap dyes to be able to use quickly, which may have ended up creating like colors of the clothes that ended up washing out a bit. But a different method of dyeing probably would have worked better also. So the benefits of this, especially creating a culture around like reusing and creating environmentally conscious art pieces, as well as like reusing just things for the financial benefit, is to make art more accessible to people and to also just not have waste laying about, because although art is not waste if it's not enjoyed at all and it's sitting in the back of your closet like some of these were for me, that's wasteful, especially if you refuse to reuse it or donate it to people who will. And a lot of the skills I use allowed me to like prevent waste in the future in a variety of ways. Number one, I learned how to paint, especially on things I already had, because most of the time I had only been able to paint on canvases, meaning that there was a lot of things I was interested in painting, but didn't exactly know how to approach how. And so being able to paint a doll that is not a flat surface, trust me on that one, it opens up a new, like, medium of art to do, and a lot of times I'm going to have more accessible to me non-canvas things rather than canvases. And also those dyeing techniques are very important. I think it's something that almost everyone should be able to do, partly because clothing will also be able to be dyed. And so being able to reuse something if it goes out of style, and kind of like dyeing is one of the easiest ways to do so. And so building up these skills allows for repurposing of not just porcelain dolls, but a variety of objects and etc. Ignore the title, but a lot of the help that I got was from family members and friends who either like gave me, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of their excess materials, or they like helped me with a lot of the skills that they were good at. My mom attempted to teach me crocheting. I failed miserably after attempting to make a bag for the dolls. And then my dog ate it. But I also learned a lot of stuff, especially from my grandma, when it came to being able to sew properly. Although she taught me mostly machine, and I ended up hand sewing the majority of this because of the delicacy of the fabric, and like they're smaller clothes than human clothes, right? But being able to have those people to teach me these skills made it much more approachable, especially if they could already give me brushes or thread, fabrics, etc., that they knew would work well for me. So the process of creating these porcelain dolls was, like I mentioned earlier, like creating these sketches based off a general like idea or aesthetic that I had in mind. And the doll that I sparked this entire project is this one, which I did not make. If you can't tell, there's drastic quality difference between this one and the other ones. But kind of this idea of having this creepy doll with fun clothing, etc., was what I based this project off of. And so a lot of these dolls were, one, based off the outfits that they already came in, and two, based off of like, well, how do I make this creepy? And I did that in a lot of different ways. But a lot of these sketches, the initial one was a bit too ambitious, but I would like change these sketches, and after each completed doll, I would alter my expectations to better fit that. And so, although the like steps that I took first, second, and third changed based on the doll, the first doll I changed the clothes up first and then painted. But I found that it was actually much easier to paint and then work around that and find like, if I mess up the painting in a certain area, well, then I need to cover that with clothing. And I also did the hair first for some reason, which did not turn out well, and so I like adjusted these ideas based off of that. So this is the first doll I did. The paint has since scraped off because I used something other than acrylic, and so I ended up just washing her arm. But this one I did not paint as much as I intended. I instead focused more on different dolls for the painting aspect of it. So this one was less creepy than the majority, but the main focus of her was specifically the hair. I took these pearls from her original outfit that were kind of just strewn about, and I didn't particularly like, and this one just fell off because I did the hair first and then proceeded to not give any protection, but that's supposed to be sewn in. It's just been thrown about for a few months, but I added pencils to the hair to curl it and put pearls in it to kind of add that decorative thing. And the majority of the creepiness came from this doll's outfit, which I have somewhere in my laundry because I'm irresponsible. But that was just like an introduction to the hair. This is another one, which was, I did not plan on altering all of her clothes. I just didn't have the time. But I did mess with her hair to kind of experiment with, oh, well, how do I like alter doll hair, etc. And so kind of, especially because her hair had a variety of textures within it, she was used as an example of what to do. And so it was kind of like I would pick certain dolls that I thought would be best to experiment with them, and then I would pick other ones to actually be the final product. One of the final products is this thing, which I'm realizing I didn't put her brain in, but she has kind of a painted head. It's meant to have a brain in there, but I took it out and forgot about it, and it's kind of meant to be a zombie bite thing. And my original plan for her was not this, which is why the sketching to determine whether or not the goals were set and to like determine, well, how am I going to progress, was not great. But her head fell off because this is supposed to be attached with strong glue, and it was not. So the reason why I don't have her clothes on is because her clothes cover the bite. And her hair, when put on correctly, covers the blood in her head. And so instead of going with my initial plan of her being like a kind of witch type thing, I instead made a zombie because I altered my goal for this specific doll based on her head falling off, her hair. And so the majority of the project was painting and sewing specifically. This doll here was my first full body one. And so I painted her completely black and then added these kind of like silver streaks to her. And it was kind of the first step to that. And so the majority of the project was either painting them similar to this or changing their clothes to include this. This one was a bit peculiar because I added this zipper into this, and all the other clothings was mostly just cosmetic changes, but this one was a practical one because I struggled to move her clothes on and off. And so this allowed me to quickly change it, which I struggled with personally sewing clothes that worked well with this. And so I'm happy that I finally was able to like make a clothes or at least alter one to be accessible, which was accessible or like easy to use, which was one of my goals. And then I also added this kind of frilling at the seams, which number one made the sewing of the dress less noticeable, and just made it seem more cohesive, as like the white parts were throughout all of the dress. And so this is my best example of what the majority of the ones were using. But then some of it was also used for hair altering. I gave her this like curl in her hair. Not sure how I feel about it, but it happened. And although this hat wasn't completely my doing, I also added this frill again and these fake flowers, which I think I took from a different doll. And so there was a lot of repurposing within the project. It's kind of, there was no set process to doing everything. It was mostly, well, what resources do I have and how do I use them better? Yeah. And then this is the final one, which I spent the most time on. The underdress was partly altered. She already came with this simple one, and so I added this thrill at the end and on the sides. And then I proceeded to make this top layer dress. And I use the same ribbon for this one and this one, but one dyed and one did not. And so this is my best example of all of the skills that I had learned. I painted her completely. Her cracks are much more like seemingly natural, partly because I layered them on top of, rather than painting one layer and moving on like the other one. And she was dyed much better. She was blotted in certain areas and left to dry, and kind of like having that spontaneously of where like the dye was put allowed it to seem much more like naturally dirty, which was the point of it. And so I took this one into consideration and attempted to make her face pretty much the same. It took a ton of color matching, but this is kind of like the doll that seems to be the embodiment of everything I've done. Yeah. There was not a set process or a full defined goal that could be applied to all of them equally, especially because a lot of times some of the changes done to my plan or original sketches were based on design choices, and some of them were practical choices of I could not make a steampunk hat. I set very high expectations for the first doll, and so it was mostly just building a variety of skills. In certain dolls I prioritized hair, and certain dolls I prioritized, well, painting, etc. And this one I kind of mixed them all together. I altered some clothing. I made this top. I added this kind of hair ponytail, I know names, to the doll and painted her. And so this was kind of like all of the skills coming together.